Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and I would like to thank the organizers, SIANI and SIFI, for inviting me to this seminar. I studied here in Umeå, so it's really great to see that there's so many students here. I wish there was seminars like this when I studied here in Umeå. I've been invited here to share some of my own personal reflections based on many years of working, as Fredrik was just saying, about sustainable development and forest policy. And this is a topic that is dear to my heart. I'm not a very high-tech person. I'm a very low-tech, so I'm just speaking from the heart, and I hope the messages will come forward. So the talk that I'm going to give I'm calling it Global Land Reformation, Landscape versus Sector Approaches. So we've heard now two very excellent presenters here, mainly focusing on the landscape approach. And I'd like to sort of give a little bit of a comparison to the sectoral approach. So I will be talking about the pros and cons of these two concepts and approaches. But first, I would like to take you back to the 16th century religious and political and intellectual and cultural upheaval that split the Catholic Church. And you might think, what does this have to do with things? And that's just to make you awake and alert. Reformation, well, it comes from the Latin word reformo, meaning to give new form, to renew. And as you are fully aware, the Reformation of the Church sparked dreadful wars in Europe, and it was a conflict that continued for many, many years. And as a result, well, not only was the Church divided, but it also led to long-lasting political, economic, and social and culture changes as well. So my question here is really, are we today witnessing a global reformation on land? So think about that. For decades, we've been managing our lands from a sectoral approach. We heard about that. We are taught at a very early age to understand our world subject by subject. But our cultural identity is often manifested through a clear sense of belonging to a particular landscape. Björn was showing the picture that his grandfather showed him. Well, that's his cultural identity. So we all have this sense of belonging to a certain landscape, but yet we tend to dissect it into pieces. As managers and experts on land, we are trained and specialized in professions such as forestry, agriculture scientists. And we have been dividing the landscape when we manage the land into different sectors. And as we heard from Liz, well, the result had not been satisfactory. The pieces simply don't add up. So there is something wrong with the equation on land. And I think this is out of that problem that the landscape approach has come forward. It's grown out of this problem. As we've heard, the landscape approach seeks to optimize people and the natural environments in a living landscapes across the world. And Liz just showed us ample of examples of where this has been done. So clearly the landscape approach has sparked great interest by scientists and experts. And many of you, perhaps in this room, is already part of this land reformation movement. Well, I'm not a preacher, even though I stand up here. Looks like I'm preaching for you. I'm not a scientist either. I'm actually very much hands-on practitioner, someone seeking pragmatic solutions and often policy solutions. That's what I have spent most of my professional life on, working on a sectoral or cross-sectoral policy solutions. And so I would like to tell you something about what I see as some of the strengths and weaknesses of the sectoral approach versus the landscape approach. And since we're in an educational setting, what more better than using the, well, it's not called the blackboard anymore, it's called the whiteboard. But here are some of the pros and cons that I would like to tell you a little bit about. So my experience, why am I really allowed to stand here and talk about these things? So from the sectoral approach, my experiences comes both of working on mainly forest policies, so that it's from the forest sector approach that I have gained most of my experience. Working on national forest programs or working on criteria and indicators for sustainable forest management. But at the more operational level, I've also worked at SCA, a large Swedish forest company, implementing ecological landscape plan. So that's sort of my background. I've also been involved in some projects linked to the International Model Forest Network. So that's really my sector approach, and my experiences and my lessons learned come from working on those. So let's start with some of the strong points that I find from the sectoral approach. Well, I have listed here common language and strong identity. I think this is one of the key points of the sectoral approach. Each profession has its own language. As foresters, we develop a particular vocabulary, and so does agriculture scientists. And we tend to feel more comfortable speaking with those that sort of speak the same language on land. And there is a really strong community and identity in the sector. The other one thing that I think is a positive thing with the sector approach is clear objective and a common frame of reference. Internationally and also nationally, we have a lot of different sectoral visions, goals and targets, and this all creates a frame. We know in the sector what we'd like to achieve, and I see that as really a strong point for the sectoral approach. Also, the other point that I like to raise as a positive is monitoring, assessment and review. We've been managing the lands sector by sector for quite some time, and through that experience we have developed a long list of indicators, criteria and indicators for how to monitor and assess and review progress. And I think this is really a key in any kind of management, is to have the knowledge of your resource. And then what you do with that, that's another thing. But that's a strong point for the sectoral approach, that we have that experience. Well, there's also weaknesses, otherwise we wouldn't be questioning this approach, right? So some of the weaknesses I have put here, 2 of them. Probably could be longer, but I could spend a day talking about this. So I've listed here threats outside the sector. And what I mean by that is often, well, really it doesn't matter how well you plan and organize your own sector if the threat of that sector is actually outside. Take deforestation, for instance. Deforestation, the main threat to deforestation in the world. Does anyone know? In the audience? Agriculture, yeah. Consumption perhaps too, but really agriculture expansion is the main threat to deforestation globally. So in order to deal with that problem, you really need to be engaging other sectors. So this is one of the weaknesses of the sector approach. Moving forward to another weakness is the social component. I often found that a sector approach really puts the natural resource in center, and then it loses out on the social issues. It tends to really focus on the long-term management of that particular resource itself, and it really loses out on thinking and planning around the people who depend on that resource the most. I think things have moved forward, but in the past anyway, I think this has been a clear weakness that I see with a sector approach. The lack of clear rights to own and use land has driven millions of people out in poverty and and has also encouraged widespread illegal logging and forest loss. This is clear. And another thing that is dear to my heart is also gender equality. I think in many parts of the world, women don't have the right to own or inherit land, and sector policies have not been, they have been weak on this part to really acknowledge these type of issues. And so I see that as perhaps another weakness of the sector approach. Then moving to the landscape approach. Well, on the positive side, it's clear now all these two have already been mentioned by Liz so eloquently about the multifunctionality. It's about reaching out to stakeholders, but at the landscape scale, not multifunctionality within a sector. We work a lot on multifunctionality within the forest sector, but here we're talking about multifunctionality across different land uses. And that, of course, involves much more, many different stakeholders that normally are not involved in. Some of them are involved in several sectors, but some are very unique to a certain sector. And this is a key strength, I think, in the landscape approach. Then optimization of different land uses. This is another a positive thing or strength of the landscape approach. It really is this reconciliation, I think you used that, Liz, of the different land uses, and to try to have a focus that there obviously has to be trade-offs made in order to optimize the different land uses in a landscape. From my experience, kind of the best example of this I have found comes from restoration projects. Because one thing that in order to do trade-offs, you really have to have partners that are on a more equal footing. And I think that when the different sectors also see a sort of a shared or shared entry point, that's also when the landscape approach is mostly successful. And in degraded landscape, of course, most values of that landscape is lost. So all the sectors have an interest to come in to restore the landscape, whether it's for agriculture or for forest or other purposes. So I think for me, personally, it's really in the restoration projects that I have seen that landscape approach works the best, where you can more effectively implement and try to find an optimization of these various different goals and targets. Then on the weaknesses that I see from my experience is obviously what has already been touched upon, the lack of clear frame. We don't really know exactly what it means. Björn said something like 99% of all people don't really know what the approach, what it means. And Liz, you mentioned there were so many different definitions. So this is really something that makes it difficult in really understanding the approach. Then about another weakness that I see is the communication and difficulties with the negotiating. So as I said, one of the strengths is really that there's so many different stakeholders involved, but these stakeholders need to talk and come to an agreement. And this, of course, they might speak different languages, not just speak different languages, but I'm talking about different languages on land here. Each profession has its own language, and then you have all the natural and culture and social interacting with this. So communication can be a serious problem, and also negotiating these trade-offs can be quite, take some time. So I see that as a weakness of the landscape approach. But let me conclude by stressing that I think that we really need to welcome this global land reformation. We need to start moving into a direction, breaking down the silos and foster stronger cross-sectorial cooperation. And this, I think, only happens if you dare to move outside your comfort zone and start to communicate the many different languages on land. And here I see that SLU and other universities has a very important role to play in Sweden to equip students with these skills and to focus a lot on the cross-disciplinary work and understanding. This is key in order to face the realities of our living landscapes in the world. Another thing that I like to come across as a strong message from me is really that we shouldn't institutionalize landscape approach. From my mind, I think it's an approach and we should keep it free and innovative as a creative force to enrich the various different sectoral approaches and sector institutions. We have structures in government at various different levels. It's very sectoral as it is today. And I think that landscape approach could be an approach to try to open up. But yet I don't think that the landscape approach should dramatically change and new institutions needs to come. It's more of a way of thinking and really opening up and move out of your comfort zone rather than trying to create new institutions. So as you can hear, I think in the future there is room for both sectoral and landscape approaches on land, and that they can mutually support each other. And I really see that, from my experience, implementation of landscape approach really requires a strong sectoral voice and identity. The whole point that from a very practical point of view is really to find the balance between the different land uses. But if one sector is weak, that balance is lost. And so therefore, I really argue for a case of both approaches. And finally, I'm working for the Swedish government, and we're currently involved in a process of developing a national forest program, a process where we would like to involve as many different stakeholders in this process to find the forest voice of today, to meet the challenges of tomorrow. And I hope that many of you in this room will actively take part in this sector approach, applying the landscape approach. Thank you so much.
Please, questions. I believe that was very clear. I thank you very much for this, and not at least that you did not use the PowerPoint. and thank you for the SWOT analysis. It was very pedagogic. We'll use that one. And you will hear more from Mia during the panel discussion later on. Thank you.